everybody! Welcome back to another episode of Lindsey, Byrd, and Writing is Hard. Today's interview is focused on the art of the crime novel, how to write it, how to keep readers interested in the suspense of it, and how to make the characters feel real. I hope you enjoy. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today on this episode of Lindsey, Byrd, and Writing is Hard. Today's author interview is with Benjamin Bradley. Ben was born and raised in northern New Jersey, and he has been writing crime fiction since he was 8 years old. Through his teens and 20s, Benjamin put the craft on the back burner to explore the world through running, travel, and national community service through AmeriCorps. He holds degrees from Rowan University and North Carolina State University, and he continues to work in public health and housing alongside a dedicated team committed to ending homelessness and providing equitable health care for all. His debut novel, What He Left Behind, just released on the 29th of April, 2025, and its back of book blurb reads, Oak Hill, North Carolina, is a sleepy community where nothing exciting ever happens. A town so tiny it has no room for secrets. So when a stranger is found murdered in a cornfield, Detective Grace Bingham is forced to partner with Jacob Sawyer, a big city detective who broke her heart and fled the town years prior, in order to uncover an explosive truth. As Grace IDs the Jane Doe, her identity points towards the tragic case from 15 years ago and the powerful Dockery family. Grace and Sawyer race to piece together their case, armed with new evidence for the first time in decades, even if the town has turned against them. After all, everybody has a secret they'd kill to keep. So just to start us off, when did you first get the idea to write this book?
Yeah, thanks for having me. I think the idea, like a lot of novels, kind of is a amalgamation of a few different ideas that I had over the years. One of the big things that shaped this was I spent a lot of time working in homelessness and housing in different parts of rural North Carolina, and spent a lot of time working with folks that just had really unique stories to tell. Some folks that have fallen on hard time or folks that have been working with them and really just realized that everyone has this like fascinating story that happens, but a big part of that is the element of home. And especially with Grace and Sawyer, the idea that really stuck with me the most was to try and hold in opposition and force together two people that have had very different experiences. So, Grace has never left Oak Hill. She is born and bred, knows everyone by name, knows every inch of the town. And then Sawyer was raised there and knew Grace when they were young, but has since left and kind of hasn't returned in a long time. And so I wanted to kind of bring together those two ideas of what it means for someone to have to work with someone you used to know, as well as kind of the idea of just because you are in proximity to people, it doesn't mean you know them that well.
When you mention the word home, what does home mean to you in terms of the book, but also in a broader perspective as well?
Yeah, no, it's an excellent question, and it's one that I don't have an answer for. Um, I think that it's part of my inability to answer it is in the book. I think that the truth is there's no right or wrong way to define home. In the book, Grace has these deep, deep roots, and then Sawyer has kind of broader branches, is my way to say it. And so he's been around, he's seen a lot of things, but he doesn't have the depth in one certain place. And I think in my mind, that's just a personal choice. It's like some of that isn't even a choice. Things just happen. I grew up in northern New Jersey, and then shortly after college, left altogether and haven't been really back since. So in that way, I'm like Sawyer. And then another way, I've been in the Raleigh, North Carolina area for over 10 years now, and feel like I'm starting to put pretty deep roots there. And so I'm kind of grappling with that every day.
When you're saying things like deep roots, what does that like really manifest as? So like when you have like that surface level connection to a home versus a deeper level of connection to a home, what does that feel like?
I think part of it is memory as well as just understanding the kind of nuances of, of a community. And most importantly, maybe deep roots often can look like a village. And so, the saying "it takes a village" is it's a saying for a reason. And I think that that really shows up in areas where someone has spent their entire life, especially. And that is, I've heard that from folks and seen it firsthand where I'm going to go to Lindsey's store if I need a cup of sugar, or I know, Sally down the block always has like fresh baked muffins for some reason. And I think, knowing that in that sense is something that it's a gift of being there. But there's also a lot of fun in the discovery of that if you don't have those roots of like, oh, I need help from one of my neighbors. Who am I going to turn to? Like that's always interesting too.
When you're writing a crime novel, how can you play with the aspects of home while also dealing with aspects of crime, which is more of an invasion of home or invasion of safety in a place where you're supposed to feel safe?
Yeah. So I mean, in the first chapter, I'm not spoiling anything here, but Grace is talking to someone in town and they say there's an outsider in Oak Hill. And I think I liked that, especially because the acknowledgement of outsiders means that there are insiders. And so, especially with crime and murder mystery, I think part of it was to play with the idea of this safety, both psychological and physical safety of a small town. And that same kind of fact that where I said earlier, where if you've lived somewhere your whole life, you know that place, you know that like people aren't killed. The crime is very petty. And so to really bring that type of jarring and traumatic incident into a town was meant to, really rock the community and get a sense of that. And so I think crime has a unique way of doing that, where whether it's, a break-in and all of a sudden you feel like, oh man, maybe I need a home security system, or something where, a bank robbery and you got to think about it again. I like the idea of how that really throws things off their axis a lot. And I hope that I did that in the book too.
So when did so you had the idea to start writing the book. Did you know from the start that you wanted to publish the book?
That was a loaded question. I think that so my publishing journey, which might eliminate some of that, is uh, really starting in 2019, was decided that I wanted to kind of do just try my hand at writing again. It had been you made in the comment earlier that I started when I was 8. There's a little book called Mr. Frog Goes to Jail that my mom loves to pull out anytime that we go and visit. And that was really like, obviously a childhood thing. And then I hadn't really thought about it. Was an am a very avid reader, and especially mystery and crime fiction. And then I think I learned from publishing a few books with a very small press that there's so much just craft that needs to be improved and so much to work on. And so I really spent a couple years really working on this and other manuscripts to get a sense of what it really takes to be, a high quality book that would go with a bigger publisher or with, through querying and all those different things. So I think, long story short, I think initially most people think every story is worth publishing. But I do really feel like this is one of the stories that I felt like what I wrote for me as the type of book that I would want to read. And then after a few years of querying, uh, was able to find an audience that it struck with as well.
So when you say that you needed to really work on and refine your craft, what were the things that you focused on and what were the things that you feel have improved since those early drafts?
When when I really think about it, I think one of the biggest parts of it is trusting the reader. So it's really hard as a writer sometimes where you want to make sure that everyone is on board. Everyone knows the little hint you just dropped, especially in like a murder mystery. And there are times where you can be a little heavy-handed with that, where you can kind of emphasize that maybe a little too much instead of dropping breadcrumbs here and there. And that was one of the key things that I learned is that, readers are really smart and especially avid crime fiction readers, they're looking for those breadcrumbs, like they're on it, sometimes quicker than you think they would be. And trusting that and kind of cutting the fat in that way is a really powerful way to slim things down. So I think that's one thing that really improved here. The other is just much more character development. I spent a lot of time thinking about the main characters and what do they want throughout the book, but also beyond that. I did a few exercises on my own of like, the book is first person from Grace's point of view, but Sawyer plays a pretty big role in the book. And so I really wanted to know what he would have felt about some of these experiences. And so I chose a handful of chapters and actually wrote them from his point of view as well, and then just kind of put them aside. And they were helpful to inform, kind of what was going on in the story and kind of gut check, oh, would he react that way to X? And how would he really respond? And I think that's just something that was really, it took time. And going back to earlier where you asked about, should it be published? Was it going to be published? I think one of the other things that I learned is that the urgency is entirely self-manufactured. It's so hard, especially early on, where you were like, "Oh, this story needs to be told. These people need to hear it." So like, I need it tomorrow. I need it to hit the shelves. And I learned, I mean, this was a long road, and I learned so much about just the patience and sitting with stories and characters and letting that kind of evolve with time and not, rushing to get things out the door.
No, I think it's so important because it informs you as the author, but it also helps enrich the story as well as a result, because the more it sits with you, the more those emotions and feelings, the more that process really sinks in, so that when you do return to it for the next writing sprint or whatever you have going, it feels more natural. You're like, no, I know what this person thinks. I know where they're going. And now it's not, is this what they would say? Now you know that is what they say. And so it helps the consistency, I think, throughout as well.
Absolutely.
Was there a particular voice that you feel may have changed from the first draft to the last draft while you were doing these types of edits?
Yeah, I think that one of the biggest areas that I was really cognizant of was just there's a lot of online fodder maybe about men writing women characters. And so I was really sensitive to that as much as I could. I was aware first that that was something that was going to be just important to focus on. And I really tried to write the first draft without it mattering who the gender of the main character or what that was like. But I actually spent a lot of time not only handing it to a few beta readers that were female to get their perspective on, what am I way off? Or, one of my favorite was someone called me out for some mislabeling of a haircut or a hairdo, and I was like, I have very little hair, so I don't know those things. But I think that's one of the key things that was really important was like this story had to matter regardless of who was in the driver's seat, and I think that helped really inform Grace's voice because she is, as a lot of women are, very confident, but also has been through a lot. And so how do you balance trauma without someone making someone look weak or kind of a victim in that situation? And so it was something that I worked really hard on. It's never going to be perfect. I'm sure there will be Goodreads comments down the road about that, but I'm open to the feedback.
We're not supposed to look at those. You have to,
I know.
step away from Goodreads and let the
That's right.
readers review their own work, because reviews are for readers, not for authors. So,
Well said. Well said.
why did you choose to write your main character from a female perspective?
I think it was just something where it organically happened. I wish that there was a better story to it. I thought a lot about what kind of the way that especially small communities can treat different genders. And in my experience, as a white male that has left a community, I know that often, especially single men, are treated a little differently than maybe a young woman is. And I think that there's just a lot of pressures that are put on women that are not on men. And that was really critical to putting this character in a town where, people are gossiping about her and her job. And a big storyline is her trying to get the job as the chief of police in this little town and just how the odds are stacked against her. And I don't mean to like, make broad assumptions about gender or any of those norms, but I think that was a critical component where, unfortunately there are communities where if that was a young man, they would have been like, oh yeah, yeah, like go for it. And I think that I was hoping to kind of point that out politely by showing how strong of a character Grace really is.
What was the most rewarding part for you when it came to writing her as a character and also creating the story that you gave her?
It, it was really just a special experience to get to live in her head for that long. I think that one of the things I came to really admire was the notion of living in one place for your entire life. Um, I I loved being able to write about, you walking into the diner and the owner because you went to high school together, and like you have this kind of back and forth that is really organic. And I thought so much about my old friends from where I grew up, and we're still in touch, but just trying to think of being able to spend some time in the space in the fantasy where all of us never left our town and we are all still there doing various things, and I can just, hop on over and see my childhood best friend, and that's it. And that was, I think it's something that maybe, reach out to old friends and be like, "What's up? How you doing?" And I think that was just a special thing in general.
So you said you've been writing crime stories since you were 8. What was it that initially drew you to crime, especially at a young age?
I don't know about the young age part. My mom is a big mystery reader, so I'm gonna blame her maybe for that early one. But I think that universally the mystery angle is something that is just a huge part of life. Life is a mystery. As a kid, you're afraid of the dark, so and maybe as an adult too. And you are kind of left to fear what you can't see, what you don't know. And I think that that really holds true when any kind of mystery, any kind of crime happens, is because there's so much that you don't know. The motive, why someone's doing something, who did it, what secrets are they hiding, or what are they protecting? And I like that that is such a great way to explore characters because you have people, and I think it's fun in every genre, honestly. Like, romance is great in this way too, where you get to put people in a really unique situation. And there's tropes for a reason that put people together, and the same for mystery. I think that it can really bring out a different side of someone when they're put in a really particular situation.
Did you have a particular favorite crime series or detective or anything like that while you were growing up?
I've always been a really big Harlan Coben fan. I his voice is very distinct in my reading of his books. He also most of the stories he writes, at least the last couple of years, are based in northern New Jersey, not far from where I grew up, and so it's sometimes fun to see landmarks that I remember from being a kid. But I think that informed a lot of the later years. As a kid, I loved the Three Investigators series. Three young men solving all sorts of crimes, like a modern-ish Hardy Boys kind of thing. And I remember I have all these good memories of going to the library and trying like scanning the shelf to see if they got a new one in. And I later learned the books were written many years earlier, so they were not like coming out new, but I guess the library might have just been picking them up one by one.
Oh, they saw
Um,
your reading request. They're like, we got to get the next one. The kid's moving fast.
I like to think so. I like to think that I think they're probably still like, where is this kid? What happened?
We had
Yeah,
everything except the last one. Come on,
I
hurry up a little bit.
know.
You got to go
Yeah,
back to that library and start requesting some more.
I know. Well, yeah, I mean, my idea would be now you can put this book next to it. But yeah.
When you're writing a crime story or a mystery, what type of things do you keep in mind? Like, do you know in advance who your villain is? Does that expose itself through the process? Like, how do you craft the mystery?
Yeah, I think it varies a little bit. Every story kind of comes in a different way. I've talked to a lot of crime writers as well, and the common things are like sometimes you have the twist, right? So like the like plot device that you want to use to kind of shock the reader three-quarters or later through the book. Sometimes you just have a character or a setting that you really want to explore. One of the ones that comes to mind is there's an author, Paul Doran, who writes a series of books about a game warden in Maine. And I don't know where that idea came from, but it's very clear that the setting plays a massive role in everything that is happening there. And so I think that in this story, especially, I knew how I wanted it to end, and I knew where I wanted to start. And then the middle, as with most writers, is where you're like, all right, got to get from A to B. And my hope, one of the other things that I knew going into this that was less related to crime and mystery was I knew the arc that I wanted Grace to have kind of through the book. And so it was helpful to find things that fit that, but a lot of it was very organic too.
I think it's an important thing to keep in mind because you have the plot of the book, but then you also have the character arc. And the two aren't necessarily the same thing. You can have both happening at the same time. You can have them at odds with one another. But finding the balance between them where the plot goes forward, but the character arc also goes forward.
Yeah, and I think one of the hard parts of for any author is you you need to figure out if those are going to be complementary or work in opposition or like those things don't have to it's hard to force one to fit the other if that makes sense. And that is very easy to like think about, but then when in practice you're like, wait, would they do that? Like you want to make sure they have the agency to make the decisions that they would, and then sometimes it doesn't follow the arc that you want it to.
Did you have a moment where your originally planned plot and character arc came into conflict?
I mean, kind of. I think the best example of that is so this book is coming out from CamCat Books, who have been great. And when we kind of were in the final processes of kind of talking through the deal, I worked with an editor named Helga Schier, and she was just a great champion for the book and for me. And she was very quick to tell me that I need to cut probably like 15,000 words from the original manuscript, which like from any author is a little bit of a gut punch. And I knew it needed to be shortened, but it's a big cut. And so that actually was such a helpful thing in a way because it made me just go through and cut out things that didn't actually make a huge difference in the character development or the story, or really had me evaluate which scenes had to be shown versus told in that way. And like the plotting and the pacing were really critical to that. And so there are many chapters on the cutting room floor where Grace is on a different personal journey or something else, and I think it ended up in a great place because of Helga's eye and everyone else that contributed. But it's funny now to look back on some of the original drafts from a few years ago and be like, oh yeah, that scene happened.
I think many authors, myself included, have had moments where they've been told your word count needs to be this, make it so. Um, in your experience, what did you do or what tricks or tips can you give to authors who might also be facing a need to reduce their word count?
It's a great question, and it's one that I Googled furiously. What I found for myself, and I think everyone's a little different, was there are two things. One was, like I said, going through scene by scene and just asking, is this critical? Could this be summarized or told in some way, or even delivered in a different way? Like with a murder mystery, with crime fiction, about gathering clues and evidence. And so that was a helpful lens to think through, like, okay, what is coming out of this chapter, this scene, that is really going to propel things, and what is the pacing of that? And so that was one thing. I cut entire scenes based on that. Just tried to simplify some of the middle, especially as the trying to keep the plot moving. But the other thing that felt really helpful was I went chapter by chapter in, a Word doc, and my goal was to cut 50 words, 50 to 100 words from every chapter. And you're nodding your head, so I think you understand, like, that helps also because you're like, oh wait, like there's still a lot of like fat on these sentences, these lines. Like it I think it honestly made me and my manuscript better because you had to really choose carefully. And there are absolutely chapters where I was like, nope, I'm not cutting, cut 5 words and we're calling it. But there are other ones where I've really felt that it's come true.
No, I've definitely done that where I've just been like, all right, I need to go page by page. I'm going to cut this number of words per page no matter what. And what it really helps you break down are a lot of the let's say purple prose that might slip its way in where you're really going a little bit flowery onto descriptions. It's like, do I really need 6 adjectives? Can I make it 3 adjectives and go from there? Where I think you get down to the root of this is the most straightforward way of saying this without sacrificing art and style and craft and tone of voice. Like, yes, if you tend to be a very flowery writer, don't cut all of that out so you're reading a dictionary. Like sit there and actually have your beautiful sentences, but find the simplest way to say that beautiful sentence so that you can get that still same emotion across without having 5 pages dedicated to that emotion.
Oh, 100%. And it's something that I've taken now in my writing where, I do the same thing I think all writers do, where I know my crutch words that I refer to a lot. Mine is just, use the word just so much. And I let myself use it as much as I want early on. And then when I'm coming back to revisions to do, to find and replace or find and delete. But after going through those kinds of things, and then it really comes to, like, I actually really like to go back now and try and cut some words because like you said, it also just can be a helpful and healthy exercise.
When you're writing a story that requires so many details, the evidence, the ways that, the detectives are moving this way and that, how do you keep the tension alive so that the reader doesn't get bored or get bogged down with all the details?
It's a struggle sometimes. I I think that the one of the luxuries I had in this was that there's also the tension of Grace and Sawyer that naturally kind of comes through. It's absolutely short of a romance, but there are romantic elements to it. And eh, I guess it's a will they, won't they in a way. I looked a lot at the like romance tropes to see what it might hit, or like I think it's old flames burn brighter. They have such great like taglines for all that. But yeah, I think that that helped a lot, but also it really forces you in any kind of crime novel to make sure that each scene is bringing something that I keep using the word propels, but I think that's really the word, is like that keeps things moving forward because yeah, it's really easy to get lost in like the scenery or something else or some side dialogue. Um, and that I think is one of the hardest parts of writing a full-length novel, is trying to keep people engaged the whole time.
When you are designing your villain, in many, many crime or mystery stories, we don't always see a lot of our villains. They kind of are just like Scooby Doo, mask pulls off, it was you the whole time. Other times you do get a lot of depth and insight, and then you're either shocked by the fact it's the villain, or by that point you're fully aware, but now it's come to light officially. Um, how do you make your reader feel satisfied with the villain choice at the end?
Great question. I think it's impossible to please everyone, first off. But yeah, I think one is in any kind of these stories, you have to spend some time thinking about almost the whole story from their point of view, just to get a sense of, they need to be a logical character too. They can't be this. I mean, they can be. There's nothing wrong with like a completely insane murderous villain. But I think that in a one where they're hiding in plain sight, that is something you need to really spend some time with and think about. One, I think with all writing, I struggle with the resolution if it doesn't feel like grounded in reality. So like it's so hard to talk about this without giving too much away, but I think that it's something where you want to make sure that there's enough pieces there that someone can put together that one, I think that there's some rule that someone has of like the villain needs to appear in the first like third of the book, or you're cheating or something like that. I mean, you can obviously break all these, but I think that's one where like you need to make sure they're present, but also not like the main character, probably. So that was definitely a piece to it, and I think the other piece that I struggled with that I think came out well, but still think about a lot is, if you watch like basic cable murder mystery, episodic TV, the at the end of every episode, there's this moment where someone the killer is found, and they just start confessing and blabbing about why they did it and what they did. And it's, whenever I'm watching something like that, I'm like, okay, that's not how this would go, but I get for the show or whatever it has to do that. And I think that's one of the challenges of writing a murder mystery is that you want, like you said, the satisfaction of some rationale. You want to know a little bit more of where they're coming from, especially if it's a bit of a twist. And it's hard to do that without that big speech. um, and so like, there's obviously the denouement and other things where they're connecting in that space. But yeah, hopefully that makes some sense.
No, I think it does make a lot of sense. And I think it also it brings up another question, which could be there's a big difference between the reality of what actual hunting for real life murders is like, and the fiction of this is a novel, this is something to get enrichment or entertainment out of. And I guess finding the balance between the reality of real life cops, detectives, whomever searching for a murderer, and the I guess catharsis or the interest and intrigue that people get out of dealing with the fiction. When you're writing a book, how do you keep that in mind where you're aware of like the reality of what really happens, but also know that you have to, entice your reader at the same time?
One of the challenges for sure. It's There are readers who are reading from, maybe they were a policeman or a detective, and they're looking for those little procedural details that you're getting wrong. But there's a certain license you need to take to make it work. I have a good friend from college who is a detective, and I pepper him with questions, and I also ignore probably half of what he says because there are just things that I know won't work, like especially some of the procedural things where it's like, oh no, that'll take like 4 days to get the response back, or like, this person wouldn't be at the crime scene. And some of us you're just like, I hear you, but gotta gotta work. Like especially in the something like this, it's like, oh, we're not gonna have, DNA or something like that for 5 days. And it's like, well, that's kind of hard to keep. What do you just put a little like SpongeBob SquarePants thing in there that says like 5 days later? So I think that's, there's things that you have to just bend to the will of the story, but yeah, it's fascinating to think about and like try and pick out what feels real and what doesn't.
What elements do you feel make up a really good crime novel?
I'm a I'm gonna say for myself, I'm a big sucker for a good setting. Um, I think a lot of my stories take place in nature just because I think that that is an element that is unpredictable and kind of still untamed in a lot of ways. And so I think that people entering wilderness or forests can kind of often feel like they're have a license to be a little less under the law in a way. So that's one thing that I look for is like a unique setting in some way. I've read books that are like tropical islands all the way to uh, books that never leave like the thick of a forest. So I'm a little all over the place. I I'm really like open to a lot when it comes to those types of things. Like you have these like the books that maybe aren't mysteries, but they're more like the crime fiction piece, like S.A. Cosby comes to mind as someone or Jordan Harper, who the way that they're writing, the way that they're carrying you through the story is just so expertly crafted that you really trust where they're going with it. And even though you're not trying to solve a single question, there are so many great pieces of character study that come out of that that can be really fascinating. I think also just like the other thing is I like to be surprised, like anyone. So I definitely appreciate when a story can kind of guide you one way while kind of like a magic trick. There's a lot of misdirection of, hey, look over here, don't look over there, and then all of a sudden there's a big reveal.
While you were drafting this particular book, was there anything that surprised you? Like, did something the villain did suddenly like, oh, wait a second, and that now you knew where you had to go?
Yeah, I think that the biggest surprise for me was when I would bring in side characters, or just kind of how they would approach things. A lot of the dialogue between the old friends that kind of grew up together just came very organically, and I I just enjoyed spending time in their heads, and kind of eventually I had to cut a lot of it because it was just like kind of fodder for me because it was just them, because I think that when I talk to my like childhood friends, the shorthand is just so different where you make a reference to your second grade teacher and they know exactly what you're talking about instead of having to then explain that to some stranger. And I think that it was surprised me how quickly that felt organic in just bringing them together. And like, I think that my initial plan was to have Grace and Sawyer be at odds a little more. And I think that it surprised me that it just organically made sense for after obviously some tension, but to have them kind of like put the past aside in that way. And I don't know if that's what every writer would have done, but it felt like it was something that was really true to the characters.
What do you enjoy most about your writing process?
I think it's just therapeutic in general. It allows an escape from the world and what's going on in reality. In the intro, we talked about, my day job. I spend working with folks that are experiencing homelessness and in housing, and it's extremely important work, and it feels great when we're doing it, but it also drains a lot of my hope for humanity sometimes. And writing is a really helpful way to sometimes create a world where we can provide more hope, where there are chances for a different reality to exist. And it's just fun. I like I could say a million things of all the benefits, but like it's just a fun exercise, and it's such a gift and a luxury and a privilege that I get to do it from time to time.
As a final question before we let you go, is there anything we haven't covered today that you would like to have the final word of being able to share with us all?
No, I just think, I guess the biggest thing I would say is as someone coming out with a book like this, the one of the challenges that I'm sure you know well too is there's a lot of pressure on the author to connect with other authors or big name authors to get things like blurbs or just to get the book in their hands or whatever it might be. And I just was blown away by the mystery and crime fiction community and how open and generous and kind people were. Like I'm sure a lot of authors worked with the publisher and came up with a list of possible authors to ask for a blurb. Some were North Carolina based, some were just similar genre. Um, and I was so uncomfortable sending those asks. I thought about it for so long. I dreaded it. Uh, Everyone said yes. Like everyone was like, "I love the help," and I was just, I can't go long enough without saying like how special that is and how like I can't wait to return the favor in that way. And I think that's what is really special about the writing community in general too, is like it's not competition. Everyone is really, really, supporting one another and there's so much generosity. And so, yeah, I just think like I will say that anytime I can to the world that, you know, uh, Eric Pruitt, Scott Blackburn, Chris Swan, Caleb Weigel, Megan Lucas, throwing out some names if you want to pick up some books. Um, Incredibly, incredibly kind. And, I owe them great amount of gratitude.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us on this week's episode of Lindsey Byrd in Writing is Hard. Benjamin Bradley's book, What He Left Behind, is currently available. Check out the description for more details on how to buy. If you're interested in this content, please do like, share, and subscribe so we can keep making you more. And as always, stay happy and healthy. Bye for now.